Welcome, Internet. And today I wanted to talk about a topic that's very dear to my heart, which is the psychotherapy of people with intellectual disabilities, with or without other disorders. So it's something that I really wanted to talk about, as it's where I work half of the time. So it's I work with people who can be diagnosed with intellectual disability. And basically, it's something I really value as a professional, to work with those people. And I wanted to talk about it because I feel it's important to have a conversation. Because very often, the idea of psychotherapy for people with intellectual disability is met with a lot of skepticism, mainly on the fact that how could they benefit from it if they don't understand everything as a normal person, or how can they benefit from an intellectual and emotional approach if intellectually they can't keep up. And this is where it becomes very important. I feel that it's a false belief, a resistance in a way to believe that, because these people, and I've seen it countless times, can absolutely invest the psychotherapeutic relationship and work on topics. And there's a lot of things to work on, contrary to what people may believe. Mainly issues with identification, issues with relationships, issues with the disability itself, which is always something that's going to come up when you have someone who has a disability. And those are things that are very important to work on. And I would say that sins and in the relationship are always going to be complicated for people with intellectual disability, but not at the level of an intellectual or academic level, but more on a relationship level. As often when they start psychotherapy with a psychologist, they can be very resistant, very skeptical, very resistant to the relationship itself. Because what I have come to see is that the psychologist is often the one that put a diagnosis on the disability, that even though the parents, of course, knew something was off, and the child himself or herself would have felt that there was something off, they didn't have the diagnosis, they didn't have the disability that came as some etiquette that comes and crushes the individual. So at that moment, the psychologist becomes, in a way, the bearer of the bad omen, the one that started this path of disability, the one that recognized it. And as such, he has become, at least sometimes on an unconscious and conscious level, a threat to the person. The person is very dubious, very afraid of starting something that might hurt him through the psychotherapy, because the psychologist is the one who who did the tests, who ran the whisk or the vice, and who gave the information. So they might be very afraid of the psychologist reducing them to their disability. They're not seeing the person that's behind it as a fear of what happened years and years prior to it, when, in a way, they were reduced to the disability, at least at an administrative level, and for the caring and for the healthcare system to care for them. So they might be very afraid. Others might be resistant for a whole set of reasons, but others might be afraid of working on them, as people with intellectual disability have often been overstimulated or understimulated by the parents. Over sometimes, as we don't have time, we have to try and do the maximum so that the person can basically have all the basics to try and make them be able to read, write. So there's no time for the child to fantasize, to play, to do a lot. All this child stuff is kind of rushed because the parent and the parents are often so afraid, and it's not something that is, like I say, innately bad, but they're so afraid that the child will not make it, that the child must use all of its intellectual might, or what it has, to try as much as possible to gain, or at least not be too far behind. It's something that also used to be aggravated by the fact that we used to call people with intellectual disabilities people who had an intellectual retardation, or even though it's something that we don't use anymore and you should never use it, historically it's something that gave the false impression that it's something of they are lacking behind, but that somehow if we do it right, we can catch up to all the others. That basically the intellectual disability can be cured. Truth is, it can't be. Once it's there, once it's been diagnosed, there will always be limits that the person has, but those limits are not necessarily those that people believe. Like, yes, there will be academic limits, but in terms of kindness, in terms of thinking, there might not be. For example, there are people with intellectual disability that are incredibly good once they know their environment to navigate it. Like, they know where to go and work, they know how to work, they know that they craft. Sometimes they can do it better than someone that's, let's say, without an intellectual disability, who has a IQ that's standard or even above standard. And that's the incredible thing, is that you would believe that they would be completely limited, but they're not. Sometimes they're completely able to do their craft incredibly well, most notably in sheltered workshops, which are structures that were created to help them at their own pace acquire knowledge and professional skills. A thing that still exists in France and for now, and who has a whole range of professionals to help them, which might differ from country to country, because my understanding is that in the US they purely are workshops, there's no medical or psychological help, but in France there still is, at least for now. And I met them through those workshops and medical homes. So it's people I've been working with for the better part of 9 to 10 years. So I know them quite well, I would say, at least that global type of population. And I can tell you, you'd be surprised. And as a therapist, coming back to the initial topic, as a therapist, sometimes it's important to realize that all that pressure has made them to build an ideal of what they should have been. Because as I stated in my video on Maurice Ringler's Understanding the Disabled Child and His Family, because the knowledge of being handicapped has been such a shock to the parents, such a break of what they were expecting, as a child is always invested, fantasized about beforehand. But when there's a disability, that fantasization, that idealization completely crashes down. And sometimes the intellectually disabled person can feel very guilty about that and tries against all odds to be ideal, to give to the parents the ideal child that they really wanted. And sometimes that can manifest in them really trying to be ordinary, to have an ordinary life, a home, a wife, children, and a dog. I mean, those are fantasies that are not necessarily theirs, but what they feel the parents would have wanted them to be. And that's where it becomes complicated. It's because they can't truly live their lives because they're entangled with the desires of other people. And also, there is also that horrible sin of how society judges people on the intellect. And even though we might not personally adhere to it, no one does, but this society is very judgmental of one's capacities. We are evaluated constantly on how well we think, how fast we think, how we process information, and intelligence is so very highly valued. Maybe not as much as beauty or wealth, but it's still up there. It's still a very good quality. And if you're devoid of it, or at least society thinks you're devoid from it, it becomes very complicated because you just come crashing down. In a way, you become inferior. And those feelings of inferiority, inferiority complex, as Adler would mark, is basically something that they feel, that they're different, that they try to be as good and as smart as they can, but more often than not, they end up in situations where society will not accept their version of things, their intellectual limitations. So instead of helping them through, it's kind of working against them. And that's something that, as a therapist, can help a lot, try and alleviate those feelings of guilt. And through the process of psychotherapy and through the relationship of benevolence, to try and alleviate the pressure of society itself and of the ideal of the parents. Ideal, which is, of course, something that's not consciously given, but something that's unconsciously there because it's there for every child. It's just that for the disabled child, it takes another turn and another twist. And is that other aspect within the relationship with the psychotherapist is that basically it's a moment where they can talk about themselves, who they are, how they feel, how they think, and a lot of them enjoy those moments where they can talk about themselves because more often than not, they are not listened to. Because often people just dismiss them as, oh, well, he's disabled, he doesn't understand, or he has nothing interesting to say. And that's completely wrong. They have incredible things to say, incredible things to express, and it's always downheartening to see that people a priori, because they don't even know them, just don't want to listen to them, don't want to give them the time of day. And that's, I think, the most horrible thing, is that people don't explain or give them the time or listen to them, truly listen to them. And that, as a therapist, I think is something where we can basically give them a space, a moment where they can be listened to, they can be seen as who they are and not just for their limitations. And that's something that I feel very important, even though it's always a constant struggle to explain that, as most people without intellectual disability, but most people remain skeptical because they feel that psychotherapy is for people that are intellectually gifted, or at least people that can mark their way through a good level of thinking. But it's for everyone, and that's, I think, the main point, is that psychotherapy is for everyone, and potentially it can help everyone, even though it might have its limits, and it often does, but it's always a help, it's always a plus, and it's always a bonus. And this is another thing that makes psychotherapy very important for people with intellectual disabilities, that they're 3 times more likely than most people to develop other mental disorders. Not necessarily intellectual disorders, but things like depression, like they're more at risk of psychosis also. So seeing a therapist can make those other disorders more manageable for the person and for the environment. Because as you might know, often the intellectual disabled person comes with its family. They come with their family. The whole family system is there. And when they're benevolent, the family's benevolent, wants to work with the therapist, they can be a precious help to help the person, to boost the person outside of the consultation room. As one might understand, the family can be a precious, like I say, gift for those people, even though there's all those unconscious levels. Consciously they're there sometimes, and when they're there, they can be of help, and you can help the whole system, family system, try and adjust well giving to the intellectual disabled person a sense of individuality and reinforcing who they are, both on a conscious and unconscious level, and give them a sense of pride, because that's important, and that's something that often goes amiss, is that they can't feel pride in themselves. And I think that that's very important, to be able to give them the space to feel the pride, to feel the warmth of a human relationship without the pressure of being who they're not and trying to compete with people who they can't compete with. So that's what I wanted to say. And that's why I feel that it's so important to maintain a psychotherapeutic space for people with intellectual disabilities. I hope you were interested by this, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.